Today is Tuesday, June 24th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Billy Hollowell. Iran launched missile strikes on Monday targeting U.S. military base in Qatar. The attack came in retaliation for the weekend U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. You can subscribe to the show, give us a rating, and send us your thoughts. Our email is quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. You can also head on over to cbn.com/quickstartpodcast. Joining me today are Trey Goins-Phillips and Madison Seals. How you guys doing?
Doing well.
Yeah, happy to be here. And sometimes I do need people to tell me my thoughts because sometimes I just can't figure them out myself. So
that's right. You can email them, Trey, if you want the email address.
Right. Send us our thoughts too.
Well, Madison, there is a fun new museum that's opening up in Nashville. What can you tell us about that? Give us a little preview.
Yeah, it's called the Museum of Christian and Gospel Music, and it opens its doors in October of this year, so not too far off. And we'll get into some of what you can expect to see in it and what the museum hopes to highlight the most.
Very good. Very good. We're also going to be on the main thing, talking with John Burke. He's a pastor and an author, and he's studied and examined more than 1,000 accounts of near-death experiences. So we'll have that interview for you. Make sure you subscribe, too, to all of our other CBN podcasts. We've got Newsmakers, Faith in Culture with Trey. We've got Navigating Trump 2.0 and Heaven Meets Earth. You can subscribe to those shows. You'll find all the information in the show notes. Now, let's dive into the news in 90. Iran launched missile strikes on Monday targeting a U.S. military base in Qatar. The attack came in retaliation for the weekend U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites. None of the missiles actually reached the Al-Udeid air base. They were intercepted by Qatar, where the base is located, and residents described hearing the explosions in the air. Now, this is interesting. The Qatari Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemned the attack and said that the nation reserves the right to respond, but Iran has reportedly said that they actually coordinated with Qatar, further complicating the situation, causing some to wonder if the attack was mostly symbolic in nature. All that aside, the biggest news to come from the region after all of this was that President Donald Trump announced Monday that Israel and Iran have reportedly agreed to a ceasefire deal that will essentially be implemented over a 24-hour period. We'll continue to cover that as it unfolds. And an Israeli family is thanking God after surviving missiles that were incoming from Iran. Ariel Levin Waldman and his family were faced with a direct Iranian missile strike on their home. This again happened in Israel. They heard sirens blaring in the early hours. They rushed to their basement shelter, but before everyone made it inside the shelter, the missile hit. They were blinded by dust in panic, and he had to grab his baby and free his trapped mother-in-law. Really a chaotic situation. Here's what he had to say. He said, "When I say that we are only alive by the grace of God, I mean that, because there's no luck, there's no physical explanation that I could imagine for us taking a direct missile hit and all 6 of us being alive at the end of it." A pretty incredible story. And then we have Texas Governor Greg Abbott. He signed into law a bill passed earlier this month by the state legislature requiring the 10 Commandments to be displayed in all of the state's public school classrooms. Meanwhile, a federal appeals court declared a similar Louisiana law unconstitutional. Now, Abbott announced that he had signed the bill on Saturday. It makes Texas the largest state to enact such a law. The bill is known as SB 10, and it's going to require, again, every classroom to visibly display a poster that's at least 16 by 20 inches featuring a specific version of the 10 Commandments. The poster cannot include any text other than the language laid out in the bill, and no other similar posters may be displayed. Those are just some of the top headlines. You can check those stories out and more at cbnnews.com. A lot of really interesting things happening in the world today. Obviously, this Texas story is interesting, though. I'd love to get you guys to weigh in on this. The idea that the 10 Commandments need to be displayed, they're required to be displayed, and yet you have this other federal appeals court declaring a similar Louisiana law unconstitutional. What do you think about that, Trey?
Well, this is something that I've said on the podcast several times, and I know that you've talked about this and written about this as well, Billy. And the reality is that the Ten Commandments, the Old Testament in particular, is not just a religious document. It's not just an evangelical document. Yes, primarily it is that. It's the story of God, of creation, of all of that. But also, it's a historical document, right? Our system of politics, our judicial system, the way our government runs, all of that was built on Judeo-Christian values, and the Ten Commandments are kind of the chief cornerstone of our country and how we operate as a nation and civically. So I think putting the Ten Commandments publicly in those places on government lands, on government property, makes sense, because that really is the chief cornerstone of how we've built our entire society in the West, but certainly and especially in the United States.
Right. And I think most people who would actually read through the Ten Commandments, if they haven't yet, would agree that most of those, not most, all of those things are moral realities that we should be striving for. Respect your father and mother, do not murder, do not steal. These are all things that as a society we should be striving for. And really, that's not usually the debate, is that the things in the Ten Commandments, the things in scripture are not good things to be followed. Usually it's, oh, there should be a separation of church and state. But of course, as we know, the letter to the Danbury Baptist Church by Thomas Jefferson was to protect Christians being able to speak their faith, speak about their faith, and share the truth in the public square without being silenced by the government. So I think this is encouraging to see this happening in Texas. And like you were saying, Trey, it's an important historical document for not only students, but teachers and faculty to be aware of as well.
Yeah. No, that's so true, and it's such an interesting battle. I mean, at a time in this country where people were praying, kids were praying, there have even been, opportunities and attempts to, in certain states, South Dakota had one of these bills where they were trying to create a space that was sort of an empty space. You weren't told to pray during it, but you were kind of saying, hey, look, if you want to pray, pray. If you don't want to pray, don't. If you want to just center yourself during this time, starting the day with that, and that even failed. I mean, at the end of the day, our schools really do need more moral guidance. And I think we've seen that again and again. So it'll be interesting to see, though, how Texas navigates this and what happens next, legally speaking. But that brings us to our focus story. And Madison, we teased this at the top, but there's this new museum opening in Nashville. It'll be coming later this year. What do you know so far? What can you tell us about this museum?
Well, this museum has been an idea long in the works, and the vision for it came from the Gospel Music Association and its mission to expose, promote, and celebrate the gospel through music. So they started planning a dedicated space to honor the history and the impact, past, present, and future of the genre, with things like interactive exhibits, faith testimonies on display, live performances, and they figured what better place for a museum like this than in Music City. So the idea had the support of Governor Bill Lee and Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell, who actually attended the groundbreaking ceremony last year, and a couple of well-known artists, Michael W. Smith and Jacqueline Carr, performed at the ceremony. So there's a lot of support around this project and the impact that it could have on the community.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about the significance of the museum's location.
Yeah, so I've been to Nashville a few times, and you don't have to visit to know that it's filled with music. The streets are lined with restaurants and bars, blasting music almost 24/7, which, if people haven't visited, it is a really cool experience. But what I didn't know was that Ryman Auditorium, which is close to where this museum will be and is most known as the home of the Grand Ole Opry from 1943 to 1974, used to be a church. And Natalie Grant was actually the one who pointed this out. She's going to be performing at the grand opening of this museum. And she said that people look at the Ryman as the mother church of country music, but actually the Ryman was originally a church that housed a revival. So the cool thing about the museum's location is that it's in a city where there was a revival before there was country music. Or as Natalie Grant said, there was a Bible before there was boots. And that really gets at the heart of the museum and why it's being built, which is not necessarily to showcase the celebrities, but to showcase God's work in their lives and through their lives. And I love how Natalie Grant described her hope for the museum. She said, right in the midst of crazy Nashville, a lighthouse is going to be the Museum of Christian and Gospel Music with the hope and the message of Jesus in it. So it's a really cool vision for this museum, and it sounds like it's got a lot of support from the Christian gospel music industry.
Yeah, that is so interesting to me because there's a lot happening in Nashville, right? People are moving there. I don't know what the current stats are. At one point, it was 300 people a day were moving to Nashville, and it's a bustling city. It's a party city in some ways, right? You were mentioning the music, and there's a lot of bars and that kind of activity going on. But at the same time, tons of Christian artists and music artists in general have moved there, either to Franklin or to Nashville. And so you have this huge community of believers there. And now you have this museum. And I love that she called it a lighthouse. That's so interesting to me. But really, with the ability to sway and bring people to the Lord in the midst of all of that. So lots of fun things happening there in Nashville.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's an important point to make and an encouraging one that this museum is going to stand out with the gospel message, because I think it's easy to get discouraged and frustrated with news of prominent Christian failing, not just in their work, but massive moral failures as well. Like we've seen from Michael Tate from the Newsboys. We've discussed that quite a bit on here, but he doesn't represent the truth of the gospel shared through his music any more than any of us listening to it do. And there's power in the words of scripture. And it's such a treasure to have a genre and a museum dedicated to sustaining and treasuring that, hopefully forever, not just in Nashville, but across the country and the world.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And Trey, you cover a lot of entertainment stories too. So I know this is something that I'm sure piques your interest.
Yeah, I think things like this are important, right? It's important to highlight these things, not because we want to celebrate the individual person, right? We don't want to celebrate an artist. Of course, it's important to highlight the good that they've done, the things that they've accomplished, the talents that they have. Those things are all good. But as Christians, the thing we want to chiefly celebrate is the advancement of the gospel and the way that God has used people, like Michael W. Smith or any number of artists, or Lauren Daigle, whoever it might be, the people that God has used to advance the gospel, and the people who may not have heard the gospel in a traditional way, but they were opened up to conversations about faith and about the Lord and about who Jesus is because of a song they heard, or a concert that they went to with a friend. Like, those are the stories of transformation that this museum and the successes of these artists will hopefully represent.
I love that. I love that we get to cover these stories too. It's powerful. Thanks so much for that, Madison. That is going to bring us to today's main thing. And on the main thing, I had a chance to sit down with John Burke, a pastor and author who has studied near-death experiences. He's looked at well over 1,000 accounts, and he joined me and actress Jen Lilly for our Into the Supernatural podcast. We want to play a portion of that for you on today's main thing. Well, John Burke, it is super exciting to reconnect with you and have you on today. A lot to talk about. We're going to talk about near-death experiences. And I know this is a loaded question because it's a complicated backstory, but what was it that motivated you, that drove you to want to tackle NDEs?
Well, it was kind of an accident. I was an agnostic. Grew up going to church, but I ended up studying engineering and working as an engineer. So my mind has always worked like that, like skeptical. How do you know? Is there any evidence? Why does that make sense? And nobody could really answer my question. So I just decided Jesus is probably a good man who turned legend, and God, you just can't know. There's no evidence. And then my dad was dying of cancer. And, this is almost 40 years ago, and someone gave him the very first research on near-death experience. So coined the term near-death experience, which, if you don't know what that is, it's when people clinically die. So like even no heartbeat, no brain waves for minutes to hours. And yet they're resuscitated either by modern medicine or, quite honestly, some cases just miracle, because there's no way you can't explain it any other way. But I saw this book on his bedside table, and I pick it up and I'm curious. I start reading it and I couldn't put it down. And at the end I said, oh my gosh, like this might be the evidence I've been looking for. And because so many of them, they talk about how they were in a place more real than this, more alive than this, and many times in the presence of this God of light and love, who was personal, who knew them intimately. They never wanted to leave his presence. Many of them knew this was Jesus or saw him as Jesus. And again, I'm a skeptic and an agnostic. I'm like, what? And it was just enough. It didn't convince me. It just opened my mind. And because of that, I actually started reading the Bible and studying the Bible. And after a year or so, for other reasons, actually for fulfilled prophecy in history that I didn't know was there either, I came to faith in Christ. So, the weird thing is I just kept, my curiosity was insatiable. I was always like, the more I learned about the Bible and studied, and then I kept running into more of these stories, which interestingly, God, I believe, I was working as an engineer out in Santa Barbara, California, which ended up to be the hub of the research that the medical doctors who were the first researchers, where they were studying most of the patients.
Wow, no way. That's incredible.
So yes, coincidentally,
yeah,
I kept running into them, and and the way my mind would go, I'd be like, wait, I heard that. And that person talked about a life review, and that person talked about this. And I see that. That's where Jesus said this and I literally started charting it. And I gave my first talk on this at the University of California, Santa Barbara in 1989. Wow. So I've studied close to 1,500 cases of clinical death and resuscitation since then. And, in 2015, I wrote the book, Imagine Heaven, really showing how there are about 40 commonalities of what people say.
Yeah.
And all 40 are found in the Bible.
It's incredible.
And and then a year and a half ago, I wrote Imagine the God of Heaven, really honing in on how people all over the globe, 70 people I interviewed on every continent, every religious background, but they're encountering the same God. And it's the God who revealed himself in the Jewish prophets and through Jesus. And I'm just basically showing how the character and the attributes of who they're experiencing fully aligns.
One of the things that I really love, and I don't know the statistics and I know that you do, is how many people basically in any given day around the globe die, and then how many of those have a near-death experience. I think it was like 5% or something, but do you recall this statistic?
Yeah. Well, the Gallup poll did a survey of America and found 1 out of 25 Americans. So that's like 13 million Americans claims to have had a near-death experience. More recently, in 2019, the European Academy of Neurology reported on a study across 35 countries. They said that 10% of the population across 35 countries has had a near-death experience. Now,
that's fascinating to me.
I still think it's more like 5%, because when I dove into the data, the ones who were actually at or near clinical death, more like 5%. So here's the thing, like, I'm still a skeptic. So if someone has an experience and they call it a near-death experience, but they're not really clinically dead or very, very close, I'm kind of like, I don't know, maybe. I mean, you kind of got to take
or is it a
word,
vision? Is it a vision at that point, right? Is it some sort of,
it could be,
right?
It could be, but I got to tell you, when they show you scars in their neck where the knife went in here and came out there, or the bullet wounds, or hospital records, dead an hour and 45 minutes, well, that to me has a lot more like, okay, tell me what you have to say.
Yeah, exactly. So 4% of Americans on average, because 1 in 25 is what you said, and then like about 10 global, but we're thinking like 5 is a fair assessment.
I think 4 to 5% is 1 out of 20, 1 out of 25.
Which is still thousands of people a day across the globe that are experiencing this. And one of the things I love about your books, and I really appreciate about your skepticism, is that, you note in these books that I'm obsessed with, that that you only really take the testimonies of people who have a lot to lose. So they're not people that are telling this story because, oh, they're going to be gaining fame or their moment in the spotlight. These are people, lawyers, doctors. I recall one with an astronaut or something like that, an aerospace, physicist or something like that, where
lawyer, aerospace engineer, surgeons.
I mean, a normal
bank
person
presidents.
Study.
You don't typically have
say I died and went to heaven or I died and went to hell, because you sound insane.
No.
And so I love that these are the testimonies that you've included in here, because they understand, they have such conviction about what they experienced that they have
a lot to lose.
They have a lot to lose. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing with this, because you have, even within the church, and you know this, John, because you've gotten this reaction from people too. There are people who will say this is not biblical, this is not true, this is not, and I want to get into all this, but it makes it hard to share the stories, A, because they feel strange, Jen, like what you were just saying, but B, when even the people in your own camp who should support what you may be saying, and again, we should have skepticism always and vet things, they're coming after you. So it's not just the atheists and the agnostics, it's the Christians too sometimes who are struggling with this. Why do you think that is?
Oh yeah, I think I know why that is, because that's why I stayed quiet, having done all this research for so many years. I say that, it literally took me 35 years to write Imagine Heaven, because I had a lot of questions too. And look, I do not believe everything every near-death experiencer says.
Sure.
I don't. And I don't encourage people to. And that's because these people are having an experience that's truly multidimensional. And so they're having to interpret somewhat what they're experiencing. But what I like to use an analogy, like imagine we're living this three-dimensional experience, right, on a flat black and white painting in this room.
This is my favorite analogy in your book.
Okay.
Such a good analogy.
I've used this with people I've interviewed that have had a near-death experience, and they say exactly that's why it's so difficult to talk about and why they often stay quiet.
That was a really interesting conversation. A lot to talk about when it comes to those near-death experiences, really compelling evidence too. And so that brings us to our one last thing. And the verse is John 14:27. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled and do not be afraid. We recently shared that verse, but I wanted to share it again because I think a lot of the events in the world right now are leading people to be fearful. And we need to remember that our hope and our joy should rest in the Lord.
Yeah. It's easy to be rocked by these things and the devastation that's happening around the world, but we can trust in a God who's sovereign to take care of us. It doesn't mean it's going to make those things easier in the short term, but with eternity in view, it makes things a whole lot better.
Right. We'll always have reasons to be troubled and afraid, but knowing that we have peace from God, which he says surpasses all understanding, is an encouragement and a hope for each of us.
Yeah, I love that. Well, that is all the time that we have today. If you want a Christian perspective to the news, be sure to be subscribing to this show. And you can email us again at quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Don't forget to subscribe to the CBN Quick Start email newsletter as well. Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll see you back here tomorrow.